Welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 247th New Social Environment. I'm Nick Bennett, the Special Projects Editor here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation on curatorial activism, queer curating, with Juan Vicente Aliaga, Clare Barlow, Birgit Bosold, Dan Cameron, Amelia Jones, Jonathan Katz, all in conversation with Maura Reilly. We're also thrilled to have the poet Mimi Tempestt here, who will read To Close today's program. So to begin, I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation, the traditional owners of Lenapehoking, the unceded land and waters on which we stand. Finally, the Brooklyn Rail stands in solidarity with the uprisings in response to the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Nina Pop, David McAdie, James Scurlock, Jamel Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Rayshard Brooks, Rhea Milton, Dominique Remy Fells, Toyin Salau, Walter Wallace Jr., and countless others we have lost to white supremacy and police violence in this country, and acknowledge that justice will come from the streets, from the nation demanding accountability and refusing to move on until Black Lives Matter in the eyes of the state. Before I introduce our host today, we'd like to begin with a brief moment of silence. Thank you. And now to introduce today's host. Maura Reilly is a curator and arts writer who has organized dozens of exhibitions internationally with a specific focus on marginalized artists. She has written extensively on global contemporary art and curatorial practice, including, most recently, Curatorial Activism Towards an Ethics of Curating. Her next book, The Ethical Museum, is forthcoming in 2022, followed by a textbook on feminist art. All three are available from Thames and Hudson. Reilly is the founding curator of the Elizabeth A. Sackler Center for Feminist Art at the Brooklyn Museum, where she developed and launched the first exhibition and public programming space in the USA devoted entirely to feminist art. While there, she organized several landmark exhibitions, including the permanent installation of Judy Chicago's The Dinner Party and the blockbuster Global Feminisms, co-curated with Linda Nochlin. Apologies. For more information on Maura, we'll be posting a link in the chat. But for here, Maura, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Nick. I am so excited to be here today and with these panelists, all of whom I've known for a really long time. And I want to thank you all for joining us as well. I want to thank Fang Bui, the artistic director at the Rail. He's given me the opportunity to present these panels to you, including this one today and a few others in the past, which are all available on YouTube. I want to thank Nick Bennett as well for his incredible assistance. This is the fourth installment of a series of panels I'm organizing on the subject of curatorial activism. The others were a general one, a feminist curating, and a decolonial curating. So this is the final one that we're doing here in this series. So for those of you that don't know me, if you can go to the next slide, Nick. Curatorial activism is a term that I coined a decade ago and extrapolated upon in great detail in my 2018 book, Curatorial Activism Towards an Ethics of Curating, that Nick mentioned. The book itself investigates and really celebrates contemporary curatorial practices and strategies that provide, alternatives, productive alternatives, transformatory alternatives to the exclusionary mainstream curatorial practices that we all know that continue to reproduce inequality, pretty much in their almost exclusive focus on white, Western, cis male artists. So curatorial activists, like the ones that are with us today, are those who organize art exhibitions with the principal aim of ensuring that large constituencies of artists are no longer excluded from the master narratives of art. And they commit themselves to counter-hegemonic initiatives that give voice to those who have been historically silenced or omitted altogether. And as such, curatorial activists focus almost exclusively on work produced by women, artists of color, non-Euro-Americans, and or queer artists. Go to the next slide, Nick. One chapter in my book focuses on the historiography of queer art exhibitions, beginning with a discussion of the 1978 exhibition, A Lesbian Show, curated by Harmony Hammond, and the Great American Lesbian Art Show, or GALLUS, which was organized by Terry Wolverton in 1980. And it ends with Jonathan Katz's important exhibition, Art Aids America. So the chapter celebrates curatorial projects by Hammond, by Wolverton, by Katz, but it also includes analyses of exhibitions organized by some of our panelists, including Dan Cameron's Extended Sensibilities, Juan Vicente Aliaga's Everywhere, Sexual Diversity Policies in Art, Clare Barlow's Queer British Art, and of course, Jonathan Katz's other groundbreaking exhibition, Hide and Seek. Now, our panelists have organized other equally revelatory exhibitions about which they'll share their insights with us in 10-minute presentations, which will be very tough because these are very prolific people, but we want to get through their presentations and on to a roundtable discussion, which will be followed by a short Q&A and then a closing poetry reading, as we mentioned. So this will be a long event. I will not be reading our esteemed speakers' long biographies. The Brooklyn Rail team is going to put a link right now in the chat where you can read about all these extraordinary people. And again, they will be organized in alphabetical order for pure democracy purposes. So we'll start today with Juan Vicente Aliaga. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Maura, so much for organizing this event. I'm very pleased to be here. Can I have Nick, the first slide, please? Hello?
Yes, coming up.
Sorry.
No worries.
I wasn't sure you were hearing me.
Here we are.
Well, thank you. And what the second one, please. Okay. Well, my first approach to queer curating was connected to the work of Spanish artist Pepe Espaliu. At the time, in the late 80s, I was not aware of what queer meant, as it would be used later in the Anglo sense of the term, put forward by queer theorists such as Judith Butler. I must say that in Spanish, translating queer has been a very difficult task. Most renderings prefer to say the word marica or maricón, but of course, this has only male resonances, leaving out the genderless expression of the word, which is used for non-binary people apart from dissident sexualities, both male and female. I must also say that around the beginning of this century, sometimes it was translated in Spanish as trans, marica, bollo. Trans is very easy to understand. Marica, you know, the male word I mentioned before, and bollo for dykes. I curated an exhibition in Barcelona in 1991 in which the sculptures of Pepe Espaliu were exhibited along the work of Louise Bourgeois. At the time, my vision of the body and sexuality was very much based upon psychoanalytic reading, which is, as Paul B. Preciado has stated in his recent text, Can the Monster Speak? Report to an Academy of Psychoanalysts, totally based upon the concept of sexual difference. That is to say that psychoanalysis does not question gender binarism. On the contrary, it reinforces it. Espaliu's work became more explicit when he realized he was HIV positive. The next slide, please. His work, performance, sculpture, drawings in his two last years was dedicated to the social sphere, occupying the streets of San Sebastian and Madrid with his performance Caring and addressing homosexuality while criticizing the government for its lack of help to AIDS sufferers. The next slide, please. This is a photo collage that he did the year he died, you know, in which he used an image from a porn magazine in which he added a covering on the penis, you know, and on the other side of in an inverted way, you can see a flower with spines. After the death of Espaliu, a marvelous artist and also a dear friend of mine, I curated a retrospective of his work in Seville in 1994. I do remember that in some sectors of the Spanish society of the time, talking openly on homosexuality was taboo. Espaliu had been very critical of homophobic politics developed by Pope John Paul II and conservative rulers such as Reagan and Thatcher. Next slide, please. The 90s was, despite the pain and sadness for the lost lives of many people to AIDS, a very productive decade. Together with my colleague Maura Reilly, a pioneer of feminist critique in art in Spain, we curated an exhibition entitled Transgenéricas, you can see the slide now, in San Sebastian in the north of Spain, which was conceived as a revision of art produced in Spain in that period from the point of view of gender and sexuality. Next slide, please. We try to explore sexuality from a non-heterosexist perspective. While we were visiting different artist studios from all over the country, we tried our best to include also male heterosexual artists whose work dealt with questioning sexual roles. But it was very difficult, not to say impossible, almost impossible. The art we found was made by lesbians and heterosexual women and gay individuals. Straight men at the time did not seem to be prompted to reflect on those issues. You can see an image of a video by Cabello Carceller in which the two women are kissing while they are hearing some noise in which some people are discussing or having a row, criticizing these women. Next, please. Now you can see another image from a lesbian collective in Madrid. You know, they did this beautiful flyer. And the following one, please. And this is another work that was specially conceived for the exhibition, in which they tried to invent situations for lesbian in different parts of Spain, you know, in Galicia, in Asturias, in Catalonia, etc., etc. Well, a few months before the show opened, while working on the making of the catalog, the director of the art center suddenly realized that some works were outrageous for him, particularly Jesus Martinez Oliva photographs of men's anuses. You can see the next slide, in which, you know, he drew a spider web around the anus, you know, trying to make a comparison between, well, trying to say that if you will insert your penis, you know, inside, you know, the anus, you know, you will become feminized, you will become like a woman, and you will be trapped by the spider web, you know. So this is one of the photographs that the director found outrageous. You know? These words could shock the audience, that's what he said. And according to him, the audience was not mature to understand it, so they decided to censor it. Of course, they avoided to use the word. So for Maura Reilly and for me, this was totally unacceptable, and we decided to ask for the support of the artists. They responded immediately and eagerly, and finally the show happened. Next slide, please. And it was, as it was initially conceived, by the atmosphere of the opening, I must say that, was not really very jolly. You know, this is also a very interesting photograph in which there's a continuity in the body of the body with the stiletto shoes, the same color as you can see. You know, it's a way of saying that, you know, practicing this kind of sexuality, you know, it turns you into a woman. A significant part of my work as curator focuses on the necessary appraisal of artists whose work has been marginalized or ignored. That was the case with two French artists, Pierre Molinier and Claude Cahin, and also with the German artist, Hannah Hirsch. Next, please. And the following one, please. For Pierre Molinier, for me, is a perfect example of how simplistic and useless the categories were in terms of sexual orientation. These artists, both a painter and a photographer, who got married and had a daughter and a son, grew a fascination for fetishism. Fishnet stockings, wigs, lipsticks, makeup were applied to a life-size poupée, a doll, and who he dressed meticulously, and also to himself. He was also a cross-gendered individual who called himself lesbien, not lesbienne, since he was attracted to female attire and developed a passion for female buttocks, although sometimes male bottoms appear in his photographs. He reached orgasm by using a homemade godemiché, a dildo, that he inserted in his anus while rubbing his body against a piece of satin or any other kind of soft fabric. The show at IVAM in 1999 was extremely successful. Next one, please. And the following one, please. Claude Cahin was for many years considered to be a man by some literary critics specialized in surrealism in France. It was unthinkable for them that such a good writer could be a woman. Her photographic work, together with her partner, Marcel Moore, is a formidable example of intelligent gender performativity. Cain also participated anonymously in the writing of some articles published by Inversion, a magazine for homosexuals that got censored in 1925 after strong persecution. When I devoted an exhibition to her work in 2001, I was aiming at underlining the multifarious aspects of her work in which literature, art, and politics intermingle. The next one, please. Yes, okay. This is, and the following one, I did a retrospective of Hannah Hirsch's work in Madrid, but I wanted very much to emphasize her relationship with Till Brugman, a Dutch polymath. They lived together for 9 years. So the lesbian aspect of her life, which is extremely important, has been very much neglected. And I wanted to emphasize that. This is a beautiful photo collage that she did. The Dompteur, the Tamer, is Till Brugman. Hannah Hirsch said that she was always attracted to strong people. Next one, please. Everywhere, politics of sexual diversity. Well, I must say before I introduce this exhibition that after 8 years of conservative rulers in Spain, at the end of the 90s and beginning of the 21st century, the law allowing marriage for same-sex people passed in 2005. In 2007, the Zapatero government, Zapatero was the leader of the Socialist Party, passed a law that allows transgender people to register under their preferred sex in public documents such as birth certificates and identity cards without undergoing prior surgical change. It is also true that trans people needed to prove to doctors their will to change. The fight against pathologization is still ongoing. Now this show. In 2009, taking advantage of a new progressist government in Galicia, in the northwestern part of Spain, I proposed to this museum an ambitious and expensive project, that I divided into different sections. The first one was a sexual paradise, myth and reality of the 60s and the 70s. The second one, the stigma of AIDS and the beginning of a new awareness. I did it in a chronological order. The third one, between queer theory and normalization. Next one, please. And the fourth one, sexual diversity in the global world. My concern was twofold: acknowledging the importance of LGBTQ+ movements born in the West, Stonewall, of course, but also Paris, London, Barcelona, Berlin, while emphasizing the narratives of sexual dissidents in artists who work in different contexts such as Chile, Venezuela, Peru, Turkey, India, Lebanon, Palestine. I try to insert, for instance, this very interesting work by Giuseppe Campuzano. He thinks of his own country, Peru, as a transvestite country, as a country which is completely transvestite, a mixture of different cultures, the culture before the Spanish conquerors arrived, the indigenous culture, the colonial culture, and the contemporary culture. The next one, please. I was saying that I was trying to insert example of work from different regions of the world throughout the exhibition, which is something very important. Next one, please. Okay, and see, this is the last show that I have organized, which is still on at IVAM here in Valencia. I will show you some images. Next one. Gerda Wegener, very important Danish painter. This is a work of her partner, a trans woman, Lily Elbe, that was painted in Paris when they're having a lovely affair and they were living, in a context which was favorable for diversity. Next one, please. Jan Mammon, an extremely interesting, artist, the observer of nightlife in Berlin, that she really explored many lesbian clubs. The next one, please. Federico Garcia Lorca, this is maybe his most daring drawing, in which he shows, the love between two men, At the time, Lorca was very much fascinated by sailors, which was an expression of masculinity and sexual drive. You can see the woman at the very back that she seems shocked, she opened up her arms saying something wrong is happening in the patio of that square. Next one, please. Okay, this is an exhibition room. The sculpture of the Black Man is by Glenn Philpott. And the last one, please. Okay, this is, you can see on the front, a sculpture by the German artist René Sintenis. And at the background, you can see a very beautiful painting, The Excursion of Nausicaa by British artist Dame Ethel Walker. These works are in the exhibition. And to finish, I would like to say that queer curating implies for me extending the vision of the individual and the collective to areas not sufficiently explored yet. The body is a key element for me. All kinds of bodies are welcome. They will enable to show the diversity of life. Queer curating also implies the possibility of showing the different ways affection and love appear and materialize. Knowing that we live in a world in which hatred is far from disappearing, queer curating is a necessary tool to face and undermine the ideologies of exclusion. I would say that queer curating is an act of militancy in which bringing to life the works of so many artists who have been invisible is absolutely indispensable. Thank you so much.
Juan, thank you. Thank you so much. I love what you just said about the art of militancy. I mean, it's like, wow, and queer curating, couldn't agree more. I'd love to talk more about that during the Q&A, and just wanted to also note that recent show, Moral Disorder, the one that's on currently, I love seeing all those historical works from the 1920s, and thank you for kind of excavating and doing such important work like we need to do for artists that are not contemporary. So thank you for the work that you've been doing, Juan, and for that wonderful presentation. We are going to turn now to Clare Barlow, who's joining us from London. Thanks, Clare.
You should be able to turn your mic on.
Share screen. Hopefully you can see it, and hopefully I will be able to get in and put it on the right view. Hold on. Sorry, I'm just having a moment. Slideshow, there we go, from beginning. Excellent. So I'm going to be talking about two projects that I did. One was Queer British Art, 1861 to 1967 at Tate Britain. And the other is one of my most recent projects, which is Being Human at Wellcome Collection, which is ongoing. But just to depress everybody before I start, I thought I'd start with what I think are some of the challenges of queer curating, and certainly challenges that I encountered to some extent during both of these projects. I think queer projects are often caught between twin dangers: a danger of ghettoization, where you become the small weird project in the basement, possibly curated by somebody who the museum would not otherwise ask to curate things, and where you're expected to put on material that would not be seen elsewhere in the museum. And the danger of those projects is, of course, that they can reinforce the norm, although they do bring to light a lot of work that isn't otherwise seen or owned by the museum. So there's a kind of tension there between doing amazing work and the status of that work within the organisation. I think there's also a danger of assimilation. That is where queerness becomes a little add-on that gives people a nice frisson when they see a few of the works on your wall, but never becomes central to the analysis of those works and to what is being said about them. I think queer projects can be often seen as frivolous or frothy rather than as serious as central. There's also a danger in, particularly the historic projects where I've worked on, of patchy survival, where some material from particular perspectives no longer exists or never existed. So as a curator, it's often a challenge to be going forth and looking for this material. Certainly with Queer British Art, a lot of the lines that we were following ended in a bonfire. And that is one of the great dangers. I think there's also a danger that these are often temporary gestures by the museum that leaves the core of the museum untouched. And that's something which in both of my projects, I was looking at different ways of addressing. So cast your minds back, if you can, to the heavy world of 2017, when we could actually go outside. But that was the point at which Queer British Art opened. And one of the biggest questions that I got when I said that was the project that I was working on in the run-up to that show was there any? There was this expectation that British art and queer art would be two very separate categories. And if people thought of anything in relation to it, they were often thinking of things like this. Francis Bacon's, one of his series of two figures in a landscape. It's quite dark and brooding, there's sort of like sexual undercurrents going on. Obviously, you know, a really important and significant aspect of queer work, but not the whole story. To some critics' disappointment, Queer British Art also included things like this. This is Ethel Sand's Tea with Sicket, a nice demure tea time scene, which I think becomes queer in a slightly different way when you realise that the woman in the hat sitting on the sofa is Sand's long-term partner, Nan Hudson, and that this is the house that they shared together, and this is her capturing a scene from their domestic life. I think there was an expectation that if it was a queer show, it had to be wall-to-wall penises. And the surprise that actually, particularly with some of the lesbian works, that there might be some aspects of life that we wanted to explore that weren't wall-to-wall penises, came as a bit of a surprise to some critics. It also contained works that related to some quite complex identities. This was a locket that was made for Michael Field. Michael Field was the collective name of what was sometimes two people, Catherine Bradley and her partner. And they had this very fluid identity where sometimes they were Michael Field, sometimes they weren't. Their friends sometimes wrote to them as the Michael Fields. Sometimes they referred to them as Catherine and Edith. And we were trying to sort of like surface the fact that the categories that we think of when we think of gender and sexuality aren't fixed. They've changed a lot, and that lots of people have found ways of being themselves which might not fit into those histories. We're also interested in the way that art functions, but it's not just about the art you make, it's also about art as objects that express identity, and that can be shared and passed on as a sort of permanent sign of that. And you can see in the locket that there's a little monogram of MF for Michael Field. And in fact, this was one of a whole set of jewelry that we showed, all of which bore some relationship to that identity. We also showed portraits and works that were sort of connected to biographical collaborations. This is Angus MacBain's, one of his photographs of Berta Pasuka. And it's an image that was actually commissioned by Pasuka to promote his ballet company, the Ballet Negre. But MacBain and Pasuka were also really good close friends. Pasuka modelled to MacBain, including commissioning MacBain to take a series of boudoir shots, which sadly we were not able to track down for the exhibition. But images like this were really important, particularly for us with our very patchy historical material, as a way of highlighting a greater range of identities than the material that we were able to find. There were also some intriguing objects that added context to these. This is a box of buttons. It was owned by Dickie Chopping and Dennis Miller. And you might find this in many houses of people of a certain age. But this is actually the souvenir of many happy nights with soldiers who were stationed near their house. Whenever they had a liaison with a soldier, they would ask for a button and they would put it in the box, and there's over 200 buttons in the box. And we used objects like this to illuminate other images of soldiers from the period and to draw attention to the fact that these artists are referencing and referring to and creating visual cultures that speak to queer cultures at the same time, and are exploring aspects of our identity in their work in quite surprising ways. To give you some idea of what it looked like, before I go to that, we also had images of works that had been claimed as queer by a particular audience, often against, or certainly not in keeping with the artist's expectation. So this was Walter Crane's Renaissance of Venus, and it was in the show because when Graham Robertson went to see it, he said, "But that's not Venus, that's Alessandro," because Alessandro the Marco was one of the great male models of the day and had indeed posed for the figure of Venus. But for Robertson, this set up this beautiful sort of opportunity for a sort of queer meditation. He said of this sort of gender swap, "Still, she was a fine slip of a boy, and in the warm Italian sunlight passed for Venus well enough." And there's this kind of delight in the role of the viewer, in finding, creating, shaping a queer world in which you can belong. And that delight of viewing was something we really wanted to surface for people. Now, to show you what the show looked like, we started off with a room that explored the pre-Raphaelites and this sort of like very fluid approaches to sexuality in the sort of very beginning of the period. We also had works that were by people who married, reflecting on that experience in the context of queer sexuality. So we really were trying to be quite eclectic. The show passed through a period about the sort of like definings of sexuality, which in Britain was certainly the Oscar Wilde trial was quite a significant event. And I set up this pairing between one of the only works to have ever been traced from Oscar Wilde's art collection, A Portrait of Wilde, on the cusp of success, and the door of the prison cell that Wilde was sent to when he was sentenced for gross indecency. The show then went through a section on theatre. It went through Bloomsbury. You can just see a familiar image, I hope to one in the back. It went through an exploration of Soho and queer cultures there. We looked at queer archives and pitched up in a room where you can see the Bacon on the back wall, looking at David Hockney and Francis Bacon in this moment where queer themes become much more talked about and much more central. Just before in England and Wales, partial decriminalisation. The project was an extraordinary one to work on in lots of ways. There were lots of sort of challenges, and there were lots of things which, as a curator, are challenges when you're working with historic material. We tried very hard to find ways to encourage our audience to think about queerness more broadly. And one of the things we did, which was actually one of the most successful things, was to create this final space where we invited people to write their own captions for works or to leave any comment or thought that they wanted to on a series of postcards on the wall. And then over the course of the show, some of those comments, both good and bad, both complimentary and not complimentary, we threaded back and put as a second layer of interpretation throughout the exhibition. And this space was, for me, one of the, though it wasn't actually, an object as such, it was one of the real successes of the show, in that it became a space where people left accounts of loved ones who had died, people talked about their identities today. Somebody actually wrote to me and said that they had not left a card because they'd never told anyone about their sexuality and never felt that they could really put it down, and they didn't feel that they had a right to. But when they got home, they had really regretted this. So they'd found a card of roughly the right size and they'd written their account on it and would I mind putting it in the space for them. So it took on this kind of like almost shrine-like function, which was really important. We also ran activities to try and expand beyond the walls of the exhibition. So we did a queer trail of other works in the permanent collection. We felt it was very important too to have something that was available for free at the same time as the exhibition was on, because the exhibition
Claire,
was paying.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt you. You've gone over, and I wanted to make sure that you got to the postcard room, because I agree with you. It's hugely important. I'd love to chat about that in the Q&A, because just, you know, getting these kind of visitor responses was so, I think, critical to the success of the show. I know you wanted to talk about being human, so I would love to discuss that also in the Q&A and the
Can I just flash two slides, a couple of slides?
Okay, 1 minute though. Okay.
There we go.
Okay, there we go. Great, thank you. Appreciate that. So we'll get back to that. I'd like to talk about that, just y'all who are the panelists, because it's how do we, you know, basically what is queer curating when organizing an exhibition that's inclusive of non-queer content, right? Just the conundrum of that. And I like that that Claire outlined the challenges of queer curating for us as well: ghettoization, assimilation, the possibility of being frivolous or irrelevant. These are all things I think that we'll come back to, because those are some of the questions that I have at large for you all. So we will turn now to our third panelist, and that is Birgit Bosold. Thank you, Birgit.
Birgit, you can turn your mic on now. You're muted.
Does it work now?
Perfect.
Okay. So hello, and also thank you to Maura for organizing this and for the invitation. These are the topics I want to talk about this evening, like a super short introduction of the SMU of the Schwules Museum for those who do not know us, and two pressing to-dos on our agenda, and maybe also inspiring for queer curating in general. Oh, it doesn't work. Why doesn't it work?
Is it not working, Birgit?
No, it doesn't work.
Do you want to have Nick take over and you can tell him the slide? Okay, wonderful.
Please
Thanks.
take over.
Okay, just 1 second and I'll pull it up.
No, now it works. It works. Now it works.
Okay, and Birgit, will you just again say the Schwules Museum and where it is, just quickly?
Yeah, I will introduce it. Schwules Museum is in Berlin. It was founded in 1985, and this was in the middle of the AIDS crisis, and it was a subcultural project funded by students who worked as guards in the Museum of the State of Berlin. It was, so to say, an anti-museum to challenge the systematic exclusion of homosexual histories and cultures from research, collecting, and exhibitions. What's going on now?
Sorry,
no, it
Birgit,
doesn't work.
It wasn't showing up. It wasn't showing up on our end, so I'm happy to run it from here.
Okay, then the next one, please. The next one. And the next one. This is just a short overview of our program. There were about more than 250 exhibitions since '85. And you can see it's like a broad spectrum of issues and protagonists and artists. You can find all the exhibitions of Schwules Museum on our website. Next, please. We are not only a museum, we do also hold extensive collections. We estimate about 1.5 million documents, photos, objects, books, artworks, and so on. Some collections, also some collections of artists. Next, please. This is like to get you an idea about our structure. I focus on the two main points in my view. Even today, The museum is very much based on voluntary work. We do have about more than 50 volunteers working in all the areas of Schulz Museum. And the second thing, which might be important, we are like an independent and self-governed institution. The funders and authorities do not have any impact to our program and collection policies. Next, please. So this is like the challenge or the to-do number one. Goodbye, curators, question mark. In her lecture, Is the Museum a Battlefield at the Istanbul Biennale 2013, Hito Steyr, the artist, states, yes, it is. The museum was and is a stage of counter-hegemonic fights, but in the same time, it's also a profoundly authoritarian apparatus for the production and reproduction of cultural dominance. And our tiny unicorn museum is also such a battleground. It is perhaps a bit closer to the progressive side. The DNA of the museum is informed by its roots in the social movement. It has close connections to alternative experiences which are not represented in the mainstream museums, and it has a soft spot on non-canonical wild knowledge and unprofessional practices. In contrast to many other major institutions founded out of the gay liberation, the critical attitude that once motivated the founding does not stop at the institution itself. Or in other words, we are a little bit more likely willing to put ourselves up for this position. One of the strengths of the museum has always been that people who didn't have the right diplomas and who didn't have the right careers have always curated exhibitions. So to say, they hijacked the format and its cultural power. Even though it's not easy to preserve this initial impulse. The institution, the apparatus, the bureaucratic procedures, the so-called professionality are often not really helpful. So the question is how to put this apparatus at service of this impulse, or how to transform the museum even more to a service provider that support communities to negotiate and expose their own stories. I want to present some, next please, some projects which do have this format. One was broadly perverted, curated, or even better moderated by Birgit Bosold with a big impact, or like a impact by the community itself. Next, please. This was Object of Desire, an exhibition which was curated by a sex worker-led collective and explores stories around the everyday practice of sex work in Berlin. Next, please. This was Trial and Error. It's a project which was produced by two artists, Giegold and Weiss, and their approach is fundamentally performative and community-based. The audience always becomes the author of the show, a really interesting format. Next. This was a specific reply to the 15th anniversary of Stonewall riots, also curated collectively and very much community-based. Next, please. And this is the highlight 2021, Mercury Rising, the second show in Germany ever on intersex issues, and again, curated by an intersex-led collective. Next, please. So the second to-do on our list is revisiting history. Next, please. Just 1 week ago, a study or a survey was published. The survey was commissioned by the Commission of the Reappraisal of Sexual Child Abuse and was conducted by independent scholars. The museum supported, the Schulz Museum supported the project from the beginning on, and we made our archives available without any restrictions. So the archive of Schulz Museum became the main source of this survey. The survey explores in detail what we all knew before. The close ties between, or the close ties of sexual activism with gay movement until the late 90s, and the widespread acceptance of the demand for legalization of the sexual context between adults and minors. The museum itself was part of this broad conglomerate of acceptance and support. Its archive is, so to speak, a perpetrator archive. There were hardly any witnesses of victims, but there are extensive holdings documenting the perspectives of pedosexual organizations and protagonists, including many perpetrators. Likewise, there are also many positive or at least uncritical references, yes, thank you, in exhibitions. This is one example from '97, and you can see it said that pedophiles are most affected by social and penal repression. The survey is, in our view, only the first step. We hope that this investigation will give a strong impulse for a broad political and academic reprisal. For example, to think about how to deal with this evident coalition between gay rights organizations and pedophile activists, with the fact that in the 70s and 80s, we find numerous gay-oriented magazines which promote sex between children, even running pictures of naked boys. Or at the same time, booklets were published where the Association of Gay Lawyers gave advice for accused men on how to avoid punishment. And last, the question is, what does it mean for the narrative? Like the post-Stonewall narrative, for example, which has been told more as a pretty story of upright fighters for freedom and justice. And another question could be, how does this affect queer art and its history? How do we assess the references to ancient times and their concepts of pederasty, which are so formative for the gay culture until the second half of the 20th century? And what's about contemporary art? Are there critical contributions, or did it rather make itself an accomplice? Or is it stupid to question like that when it comes to art? I'm very much, thank you so much. And I'm very interested and looking forward to the discussion. I'm in time, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely on time. Thank you so much, Birgit. That was brilliant. And yes, those are very, very provocative questions. And I also am looking forward to talking about this. I just want to say that I did not realize that anybody could curate exhibitions. And I loved how the collectively curated. That's wonderful. I didn't know that part of Schulis's sort of practice. So I know more about that as well. Because I like how you said it hijacks the cultural power, which I think is a wonderful way to phrase the kind of curatorial process. Thanks for sharing all of that with us today. And I will turn now to Dan Cameron, who's joining us from New York. Thanks, Dan.
Hi, Dan, your mic is off.
Yeah, your mic's
okay, here I am. Thank you very much, Maura. I'm actually in Chicago right now. But I want to also thank Brooklyn Rail and Nick and everyone there for putting this together. So I thought as a queer curator that I would kind of approach the subject a little bit through my own personal evolution. I'm from a very small town in upstate New York. And what you're looking at right now is the panel discussion for Extended Sensibilities, the exhibition that I organized at the New Museum in 1982. As I said, I'm from a very small town and I grew up in the 70s and I was out by the time I was 16 and I knew, everyone in town knew, we had numerous queer people in town, everybody was out. It just seemed like what you did in the 70s. So you can imagine my surprise when I came to New York and Marcia Tucker invited me to make a proposal while I was volunteering at the museum. And I told her I wanted to do a show of homosexual identity and contemporary art. And literally I was too dumb I was too much of a hayseed to know that that was not appropriate, that was something that many, many artists would resist and fight against. And if you're wondering about the expressions on the faces of all these esteemed panelists, it's because we're all still in 1982 tormenting ourselves about whether we could even talk about sexual identity and art. And maybe we could go to the next slide. And so I just felt like, for me, being queer in the 70s context was about being free and expressing freedom through your work as a curator in this case. So for instance, I was interested in presenting erotics in the exhibition. You can see here Fran Wynant, painter on the left, who's sort of in an erotic position with her dog, and on the right, Gilbert and George, who actually refused to be in the exhibition after they'd already accepted, and we'd gone to press with the catalog. So the picture you're seeing here was lent surreptitiously by New York collectors, and no one told Gilbert and George until about 12 years later when I met them in London and gave them the catalog, and they didn't seem to remember having expressed the wish to not be in it. If you could go to the next one, please, Nick. So for me, again, and following a 70s ethos, perhaps, the idea of expressing erotics through art as gay people involves, if you see on the left, in John Henninger's case, bathhouse culture with, trade, waiting somewhere in a steam room, or on the right, sort of drag culture, as represented by Charlie Brown's painting of a friend of his who was trans called B, not bi, B, and he would do paintings of her on cardboard. How these two images got juxtaposed, I can't possibly tell, but I will mention that we were criticized a lot for the Henninger as the exhibition wore on, because AIDS was just becoming a public subject of discourse at that time. And there was the belief that, in showing this work, that we were actually promoting irresponsible sexual behavior, which is something I'm willing to concede, although at the time it was done, no one knew. I mean, no one could have suspected that that had happened. So this was done. I just want to say this exhibition was curated in 1982. I was 8 years out of high school, not even 8 years out of high school. So very much this sort of spirit of naivete that came into the kind of bringing together of these artists and firmly asserting the important role of identity in contemporary art was something that I literally did not know better than to approach. And because so many people at the time told me that if I ever did this exhibition, I'd never work in that town again. So we can go on. Felix Gonzalez-Torres, I'm bringing this into the discussion because this piece was created for the first time for the exhibition El Jardín Salvaje, which I organized for the La Caixa in Madrid in 1991. Felix was a good friend of mine. The piece is subtitled Revenge, and it's subtitled Revenge because he was sexually molested as a refugee child from Cuba in Madrid by a brother, by a member of the clergy. And so I think that I always was confused after doing this exhibition, and because Felix and I had long gay man to gay man talks about his lover Ross in the Catholic Church and the Eucharist and cannibalism and how all of these things went together. And I've often, questioned how this reading of this certainly fundamental work in our history of the last 30, 40 years is still incomplete. This part of the work seems to still remain in the shadows. If you can go to the next one, please. My mentor in contemporary art was really Carolee Schneemann. I discovered her work when I was an undergraduate. And yeah, Carolee wasn't queer, but at the time, the way she fused gender performance and sort of a radical feminist critique with notions about the avant-garde and an experimental artistic practice was really a breakthrough for me. So we were very good friends from the time I was an undergraduate. My first published article was about Carolee. My first exhibition at the New Museum was a survey of Carolee's work. And so I feel like I'm still queer, or rather I respond or understand Carolee's work queerly, if that's the right way to describe it. Maybe we could go on to the next image. So I joined the new museum in 1995. I was there for 11 years as senior curator. And as I look back at it now, I realize I did a lot of queer shows. One of them was of my dear friend, Martin Wong, who was self-taught as a painter. He was very interested in Puerto Rican culture, especially the life of Miguel Piñero, who is a playwright, ex-con, who lived next door to him, and told Martin about all of the stories of things that went on in jail, and what incarcerated men, what their relationships were like. And this fascinated Martin. So he spent a lot of his time depicting this in paintings. And we did his retrospective in '98, just a year before Martin passed away of AIDS. Next project, please. I was also very much involved in European art at the time. Marcel Odenbach, the German video artist, struck me as a very interesting case of someone who is recognized abroad for being a pioneer in video art, also very openly gay and also incorporating gay content into his work, but almost entirely unknown in the United States. So we did a mid-career survey of him in 1999, just really to bring all of these points of view, as well as his unique perspective on race, together in a survey of his work there. Next slide, please. David Wojnarowicz was not really celebrated that much in the sort of 5 years, 7 years after his death. And I felt like it was my role and my responsibility as the chief curator of the new museum to put his work out in public again, because it hadn't been brought together since a small show, well, a survey show at the Exit Art several years before he died. And so Fever, the art of David Wojnarowicz, really I felt was sort of a culminating statement in many ways about how someone in my generation who was already gone from AIDS had sort of taken music and literature and photography and painting and performance and spoken word and created one amazing sort of worldview from a very, very, I would say, individualistic and free perspective. Next slide, please. A show that I'm super proud of that I was associated with at the new museum, but which puzzlingly is no longer on their website, is the source, is where this exhibition came, this image came from. In 2000, my colleagues Joanna Frew and Judith Stein worked with a bodybuilder named Lori Firestein to present this amazing exhibition, Picturing the Modern Amazon, about hypermuscularity in women. And again, I mean, it's not a lesbian subject, but the exhibition included, among other people, Nicole Eisenman, Robert Crumb, Andres Serrano, and really considered gender queerness from a very liberating perspective. And I'm hoping that over time, this exhibition will be revisited by scholars of the future. Next slide, please. I also, similarly to the Marcel Odenbach project, I also presented a survey of Pierre et Gilles. What I was aware of in my interest in the couple's work was that they really are the generation of Cindy Sherman, and that this is how Americans maybe should understand the work, even though it's very much tied into, cosmetic and fashion culture. It was really staged photography at a very high level, and I continue to feel like their work is maybe undervalued in terms of their contribution overall, and that the queerness of the work has still sort of held it down in the public estimation. Next image, please. So those works were all from the past. This was an exhibition I managed to have the good fortune to put together for Howl Happening 5 years ago on the Lower East Side. I was a big fan of Ethel Eichelberger when she was alive, and got to see her many times in performance, and was very puzzled by the fact that she sort of disappeared off the map out of public discussion not long after he died, sorry. And then next slide, please. And Jackie Curtis was also someone who was deeply influential to me, although I never really got to meet Jackie before they died. And what fascinated me was that both were trans individuals and both were avant-garde playwrights. And it seemed to me that their position in in theater history was minimized, in part because people really at the time couldn't get over the transgender part of what they were doing. So I put together an exhibition called When Jackie Met Ethel for Howell. You can see the beautiful installation done by Ted Reederer. And we brought together were scripts, content, videos, performance, but also them as muses, because both Ethel and Jackie were just rapidly represented by artists of their time who felt that they were important figures. And just the next slide, please. So in the last year, like so many others, most of my work has gravitated onto the internet. But as a New Yorker, I've been fortunate to get out in the streets and be around. And then during the the marches and demonstrations after the killing of George Floyd, I was just sort of deeply moved to find that among other figures that were being celebrated and memorialized who came to an untimely death was Marsha Johnson, who was sort of a hero of mine during my early years in New York, because she was a very important, gregarious, brilliant trans personality who really performed on the street and let the public know that her identity was who she was, that was her extension into the world. So that's really kind of sums up what I've been working on over the last few years. And I want to thank all of you for giving me a chance to share it with you.
Great. God, thank you, Dan. Thank you so much. It's amazing to and I don't know how you did it in like 11 minutes, but an overview of your lifelong dedication to queer artists as a curator. So, I mean, you have to know, or at least for me, and I think if you look at the comments, how impactful your work has been. So thank you. Thank you for that. And I also wanted to point out that the reception of Extended Sensibilities and the Heinegger work really demonstrate how far we've come to some degree, and then others not, when we hear from Jonathan, of course, about the censorship of his work in DC. But I want to believe that we've made when we think about that reception. So thank you so much. I'm going to turn to Amelia Jones, and who's joining us from LA. Thanks, Amelia.
Great to be here, just getting my PowerPoint, and sorry for that coughing fit. I forgot I wasn't muted anymore. It's this Zoom thing where the second you start talking, you get like, so thrilled to be here. Everyone can see my PowerPoint, I hope.
Yeah, it's not in full screen mode. There you go, you're good.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm starting with the question, what is queer curating? And these questions have already been raised, of course, but I wanted to crystallize it a little bit. I think that it's used in two ways. It's used to talk about curating art or archives determined to be queer and or by artists seen as queer. And there is a strong tendency to conflate queer with people identified with same-sex object choice. So I'm really happy to hear a lot of information and curating with trans artists and so on, because I think that's super important. And I would mention too, curating through methods driven by queer politics. And I just want to name drop the In a Different Light show at Berkeley, which was a truly methodologically queer curating strategy that really blew my mind when I was a student at UCLA at the time. Sorry, having this. Yeah, so I wanted to raise those two issues first and then kind of leap into inevitably what has been consuming me for a very long time, a show that is up right now at Participant Inc. in New York City. It's up till April 4th. So those who are able to be in the area, you can make appointments on the Participant website. And so this show really, I hope, my greatest wish is that it does both of those things. It's pretty indisputable that Ron Athey has been at the forefront of queer practices, including not just queer content, but the methods of putting his body forth as a site of very explicitly queer erotics and BDSM and so on. But my greatest wish is that I also was able to honor, just going to go back to that previous slide, that I was able to honor in a methodological or strategic way the kind of ethos of queer. And so this show is organized around the concept of queer community because, you know, really inspired by Ron's work, that he has been at the forefront of co-articulating queer communities, but has also, you know, helped define what we think of when we think of queer communities. So the work is very often community-based or collaborative, and I wanted very much to kind of honor that strategy within his work. So again, my organization of the show was driven both by honoring Ron's queerness, obviously, and the in-your-face queerness of the work, but also the energies of a queer politics of community. I've known Ron for almost 30 years as part of the Los Angeles performance community, but also when he was living in the UK. I also was living in the UK, so we kind of keep following each other. I've been thinking about the need for his work to be placed in a historical framework that would do justice to its dynamic role in forming a number of different queer communities, especially in LA and the UK. So again, the art is understood as queer as well. The methods that I developed were developed out of my desire to honor a communal sense. And I think it bears noting in that context that because of landlordism, as Jack Smith would have it, Ron was being kicked out of his rent-controlled apartment about 4 years ago. And so I ended up with his entire archive in my house. And so the intimacy of queer community was kind of a lived experience while I was organizing this show, which was both beautiful and convenient, but also extremely overwhelming when you literally can't escape the work that you're curating. Yeah, so this is the catalog, which is available through Intellect Press, and just some shots with the community dimension of actually installing the show. And it's interesting to know that Ron has been extremely generous and supportive throughout, but very, very hands off until he showed up at Participant with suitcases full of extra props. So, you know, and this is part of community, right? And part of working with someone you deeply admire is negotiating those complexities. And I'm this kind of rigid control freak who had a plan of the floor plan of the show for, you know, at least a year. And Ron had never commented on it until he brought all these extra materials. And so here he is kind of with his friend Hermes, who's a collaborator in the work, and they're kind of directing the positioning of this piece. So very, very hands-on by the time we got together in the space about a month ago. So the way that I organized the show was very ambitious, and it turned out, because of that kind of ghettoization logic that Claire was talking about, and Jonathan knows all about my years of trying to find venues for this show, and they were unsuccessful. And of course, what often ends up happening is you end up with the amazing person with the alternative space that's quite small and modest, but nonetheless a fantastic space. And Leah Gangitano, the director of Participant, really is the goddess that you might imagine if you've ever seen a show there. I mean, just, anyway, that's another conversation, but that's part of the community, is that I was able to go to her and without a split-second reservation, with no money, no support, nothing, she said, absolutely, let's do it. And so I organized the show initially with many more sections, but of course had to reduce it and be very concise, which I think is actually fine. So it's organized in this recursive chronology. Everything is very overlapping. But these are the basic communities that I touch on in the show. And so without further ado, I'll just give you a very brief walkthrough. Religion, family, which ties together his uprising as a Pentecostal minister in a fundamentalist family with also abuse going on. So yes, the sexuality relates directly to the Pentecostalism. And there's a very important show that he organized, or performance that he organized, called Joyce, which was modeled after his family relations. So that's all in the first section. And you know, part of the curatorial issue also is in having as much of the depth, but without overwhelming with too many things in vitrines and so on. And that's a performance curating kind of problem. Music in clubs starts roughly around 1980, when he very judiciously left home and was circulating in the LA communities and really discovering this kind of raucous punk scene with Johanna Wendt and Roz Williams, performing with Roz Williams. Different ways of displaying items so that they have a kind of visual pleasure and that the show is aesthetically interesting, but also sexy, which I think is really important for queer curating, that you keep a kind of joy and pleasure in being there and seeing the works. I did get obsessed with certain things. So in the literature tattoo, there's the sex doll mouth that I just had to have on a vitrine. And if you see to the far right, you see the cod piece and the go-go boots, which I was also quite fixated on. So that's an interesting curatorial vicissitude, is the things that we obsess over. And by the way, in terms of sexy, Ron insisted on covering up that honcho image of the erect penis. He said it was an ugly penis. So I was like fully willing to put it on display. You know, so you're also just constantly negotiating someone's life when you're doing a one-person show like this. This is for Jonathan Katz. I made a huge point of having a tiny, tiny monitor with Jesse Helms spewing venom at Ron on the floor of the Congress, and then some of the press from that. And then across from that, Jesse had to face Ron actually doing the performance that Jesse Helms never saw in 1994. So I was also kind of getting revenge. And this is really where Ron played a huge role, was in these extra props, which he made quite stunning and beautiful. And then the back room was the new work, the Pisecephalus monster, and the monitor showing a slideshow of the community. So that's it, you know, but I'd make one more point and say that I was thrilled to draw actual queer community to the very limited opening by appointment, including Kembra Fowler, who appears in the show and then shows up, and, you know, and that just felt right. It really felt super exciting, and that the show was happening in the way that I'd most hoped it would happen. So I'll stop with that.
Thank you, Amelia. Oh my God. What an amazing show. And as I said earlier when we were speaking, I'm just so happy that Ron is getting the attention. He's absolutely brilliant. And so I'm really looking forward to seeing the show. For those of you that don't know, it's going to open at the ICA in LA in June. Is it going anywhere else after that, Amelia?
Well, we hope so.
Okay.
We're trying to get venues in the UK, actually.
Oh, well, maybe the Shrillis Museum. No, I don't want to put it working on this.
Berlin would be amazing.
I'm kidding. My God. But I just want to say too, I love how he showed up with extra props. I love that. Nayland Blake did that to me. I curated an exhibition of his work and he rocked up with, you know, all this stuff.
Yeah. It's all about the excess.
Yeah,
that's the aesthetic. So I had to honor it.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks for that. Thanks for sharing. And we will end our, at least the panel portion of it, with Jonathan Katz, and then we'll move into the round table. So we'll end here with a bang. So Jonathan, take it away. Thanks.
Thank you. And let me get my screen up here. And let me just say how humbled I am to be on a panel of such luminaries. And my thanks to Maura and to Nick for putting this together. I'm actually going to be going through a fairly recent exhibition. We could talk about other exhibitions if you would like subsequently, but I felt this one didn't quite get the attention that I hoped it would. And so, why is this not working? Hang on. There we go. Up. All the way, of course, in the wrong direction. There we go. So this was about face. It was in Chicago. As you can see, this is a work by Nick Cave, and it was a show that really tried to think seriously about supplanting notions of binarism, which tend to be an undergirding metaphor for much queer exhibitions with notions of transness, and what happens if transness is elevated as the defining term. And as you can see, we looked for images that sort of bespoke this. We had to, of course, locate the origins of this, and I sort of wanted to pay tribute to figures whose work isn't shown, including Harvey Milk, who is a very serious photographer. And you know, when planning the show, I just showed up at the San Francisco archive and found a whole bunch of slides of images that were fabulous. But they all said that they had a different name on them. And I was a little confused by this. I happened to know the person whose name it was. I called him up and I said, why is your name all over what looks to be Harvey Milk's? And he said, oh, well, after Harvey died, I had to sort of copy all the contact sheets, and I just put it on my paper, but they're all Harvey's photographs. Well, they weren't listed as Harvey's photographs. They were listed as Dan Nicoletta's photographs. So this just goes to show you that when you're in the archive, you always have to ask. And Joan Bieran, I wanted to give tribute to sort of the founding figures, Arthur Tress, but to really begin to sort of tease out a kind of transness as an early aspect of queer identity and queer community. Here, for example, we're looking at Ralph Arnold, once spoken in the same breath as Rauschenberg, African-American, early collage artist, now almost completely forgotten. Greer Langton, we've talked a little bit about. These works were never shown. They were actually thrown away in a dumpster and had to be retrieved by one of Greer's friends. Della Grace Volcano, beautiful work. Del has been at the forefront photographically of doing sort of intersex trans photography. Maj of the Arctic, which is a theater show about a historical incident in which an African-American woman passed as a white man on the route to freedom during slave times. And here, Majisola, an African performance artist, doing that part quite literally in Antarctica. The series was shot in Antarctica and plays off of blackness and whiteness in very complicated ways. And they're just gorgeous photographs. Of course, Kent Monkman, Canadian artist whose persona here is a kind of trans figure who constantly causes sort of trouble, a coyote figure. The work is all about many different kinds of transness. So of course, gender, but also, as you can see here, plays with cultural transness, because one of the things that Kent wants to emphasize is that there is no such thing as anything other than a hybrid culture today. We are all products of indigenous and other cultural influences in a sort of complicated mix. So here, for example, we have buffalo robes that are actually done on silk with European cut aluminum frames. So always moving back and forth. And as you can see in just this one slide, right, the idea of indigenous or First Nations dance then taking up the umbrella from, right, dancing in the rain and making that part of the strategy. Zanele Mujole's extraordinary works, which take constructions of Blackness and play them back to a presumptive white audience, here in the Dutch mode on the left, and horrifically on the right, in an American mode, dealing with idea, of course, of lynching. Maria Elena Gonzalez self-service bathroom from 1993, a remarkable work where you see a very large dildo that is essentially suspended between two handhelds. The entire work is this bathroom. And Maria specified that she wanted people to visit the bathroom in multiples to increase the erotic tension. Leonard Suryaya, an Indonesian artist. This, like all of his work, features his family. They are wonderful sports and participate in his work. Carl Pope, a African-American artist living in Indiana, Indianapolis, whose work uses, as you can see here, letterpress posters. He puts them up in his own sort of interesting combinations. And they're everything from quotations that are historical to contemporary things, you know, is it to crack or is it to cracker? And what's interesting about these is that there's no singularity to the voice. Transness here operates at a discursive level because there are constantly posters critiquing other posters in evidence here. Oops, sorry. Jerome Kaya, Eggs Having Turkey Dinner. Jerome, a San Francisco artist extraordinary, a friend of mine, died fairly early in the plague, but made all of his work out of nail polish, inhabited a kind of bad drag queen persona, and was always quick with the irony. What a beautiful metaphor of AIDS is eggs having turkey dinner. Or death shoots a load of nice days into the bay. And we've seen this already. This show featured these two works by Martin Wong. And Dugdale's incredibly moving Life's Evening Hour, a photograph that Dugdale took upon being diagnosed with HIV and because of cytomegalovirus losing his sight, and he flies to England and poses himself at the grave of William Henry Fox Talbot, who was the inventor of photography. At this point, Dugdale is, of course, convinced that he's going to die. And so it's a kind of adieu. But quite remarkably, he continues to work in part with the help of his partner, who helps him pose, takes essentially Dugdale's instructions about lighting and other aspects. And what's remarkable is that the pictures look exactly like they did when Dugdale could see. They're a continuation of his aesthetic. Alice O'Malley, another great, I think, undersung photographer, and definitely the photographer of the sort of court photographer of the New York avant-garde. Sophia Wallace, who in this series has taken a sort of the ways in which women are called upon to perform in mainstream media advertisements and gotten male models, hired male models to act those roles. And, you know, she talks about how difficult this was, that she had to break them down, she had to insult them, she had to make them uncomfortable because they kept performing in a masculine way. And she wanted to convey that vulnerability that she felt male models don't naturally exhibit. Gail Thacker, who a member of the Boston School, beset by sort of AIDS death after AIDS death, remarkably deciding to take a series of Polaroids and put them in a plastic bag where they macerated in their own juices for up to a decade and a half, and then exposing them so that the image itself underwent the degradation that's sort of beset the bodies of so many of her friends. And work here that anticipates the work of Felix Gonzalez Torres's and Attila Richard Lukács, one of the great painters, I think, in the world today. These are enormous. They're both about 14 feet tall. Attila is sort of on a tear against the United States government because his partner, who is African-American, got busted under the 3 strikes law and is now in Rikers Island for selling a dime bag of marijuana for 18 years. Work by an artist who was pretty much unknown, and then just started to get Hoffman's just started to get a whole slew of shows, and then sadly passed on. Very 80s expressionist work. And then finally Patty Cronin and a Memorial to Marriage with her partner Deb Cass, a work that got a lot of play. My point is that what this exhibition really wanted to do was to take the verities of race and gender and sexuality and to see what happens when those verities are unmoored and complicated, and how we can think in other ways, how we can think about queer art in terms of fluidity. And that's part of what I do. And then the other part of what I do is an exhibition that will be opening in 2 years called The First Homosexuals, which looks at art produced from the year 1869, when literally the term homosexual was coined by a Hungarian writer, until roughly the early years of the 20th century, and looks at sort of what those earliest representations of same-sex desire are, many artists that are not known. And what's interesting about this is that it's a fully global show. And so it has an advisory board of 22 scholars from all regions of the globe who are contributing essays and information. And it raises complicated post-colonial theory issues like, what do you do with a term homosexual firmly rooted in the West? How do you apply that to sub-Saharan Africa? Or how do you apply that to areas right far removed from its original genesis? Thank you.
Great, Jonathan, thank you. I'm really looking forward to that show, the kind of concept of like the global queer, as you and I have discussed in other conversations, right? How does one accommodate for socio-political, cultural differences, right? Amidst all of these kind of checklists. But thanks for sharing info about Face. I didn't know enough about it, so thank you. Was there a catalog, Jonathan?
The catalog is going to be out in about 6 months.
Okay, great, thank you. And it was wonderful to see so many artists that I actually didn't know. So thank you for that. Alice O'Malley and Gail Thacker, and as you said, Attila Lukács. I mean, thank you. It's this incredible work. This is like, you know, to expand the discourse, right? With artists that we all don't know, so that we can create a more comprehensive story. So thanks for that. We're going to open it up to the round table. And then followed by a Q&A. I did want to mention, because I hadn't at the beginning, that this panel was sponsored by ASU, Arizona State University, where I am an associate professor. So thank you to my boss for allowing that to happen. So I asked each of the panelists to come up with a question to ask. And so I don't know if anybody wants to jump in. I have a few, but if someone wants to raise their hand and jump in, I'm happy to accommodate the first question. Okay, well then I'll do it. And I'm also mindful of the fact that Amelia has to leave shortly. So I'd love to hear from you, Amelia, if possible, before you have to leave to get your vaccine. So I'll start with a question. So each of our queer exhibitions embody what I call a kind of area studies approach, which is to say that they sort of produce new canons and supplement the traditional discourse by focusing on, in this instance, sexual orientation. So again, anything that's outside the white Western male canon requires special attention and is a separate area. Obviously, there are major benefits to this, but I'm interested in talking about the pitfalls because Claire had brought those up in her conversation, or her part of the panel. And obviously the major benefit is we're diversifying and democratizing the canon. We are also offering up what I call curatorial correctives. But of course, there are some pitfalls too. And so those, of course, are separatist and ghettoizing. These are our concerns. But there are others too. And so I'm curious to talk about, and maybe hear from Claire, since you brought it up, how we work through these, how do we work around them? It's a sort of straitjacket that we have, right? Because in some way, I guess the way that I think about it, sorry to harp on this, but like an area studies or a queer exhibition, it still assumes the white heterosexual masculinist Western canon as its center. It still assumes that, right? We're creating something that adds to it. But how do we get out of that straitjacket? Because we're still assuming that's the center. Thanks,
yeah, this is something that I've absolutely been wrestling with. And I don't think I nailed it with Queer British Art. I mean, we were very explicit at the start of the show that this wasn't about creating a queer canon, and that there were numerous voices that we hadn't been able to represent for different reasons. I think some of the reasons to do with work that no longer survives, sort of fair enough, but I think there's a bigger issue when you're talking about the past, which is about how do you draw attention to the systemic inequalities and the fact that there are lots of people whose careers perhaps never flourished, the artists who we've never heard from because they were never able to become artists in the first place. And we did various things to try and draw attention to that, but inevitably the works that you have on display tend to dominate, and no matter how much you try and draw attention to absence, it's very hard to do that in a satisfactory way in the show. I think in my second project, Being Human, we hit a better approach. I mean, that project was developed working in close partnership with disabled activists from the very beginning. And part of what we were trying to do there was to just imagine, from a sort of quite utopian perspective, what it would be like if some of those norms were no longer treated as norms, but were just treated as alternatives. What does it mean if the body isn't the sort of like normalized body, but becomes just a series of different options? Could we reimagine the works in the space? What would be in the space? How would that change? And I think that was actually much more successful at decentralizing the sort of like white male heterosexualist non-disabled gaze, and instead looking at a series of different alternatives of perspectives. I could say a bit more about that.
Yeah. I mean, and also just want to point out that the Clare show called Beyond Human at the Wellcome Center in London was deemed by the New York Times one of the most accessible exhibitions sort of ever for the reasons that Claire is outlining, the kind of attention to kind of disability and those sorts of issues that are so prevalent and are so missing from curatorial practice. I see both Amelia and Jonathan. Amelia, I'll jump to you because I know your time's limited. So you want to follow up with that? Thanks.
No, I was actually waving goodbye. I feel so I will just throw out that, yeah, I think that we have to interrogate the structures of power at the deepest level, the same way decolonial discourse is putting that forward. It can't just be, putting works by artists we identify as having same-sex relationships in museums, which is important. It's super important, but I think we're at the point where we've got to do much more in terms of the structures of how we're presenting information in a show, for example. How are we thinking about queer? How is the queerness being addressed in the show, or how is it maybe creating a queer experience to see the work? So yeah, that's how the direction I would go in.
Yeah, I agree. It's all structural at this point to really, really open and pry apart, or even completely dismantle and throw out the window anything having to do with canonicity, just so that we can structurally redo in a way. But Jonathan, you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I don't think we're going to actually be able to, however much we want, sort of throw away the canon. We don't have that kind of power. So part of what I want to do is always, screw around with, queer the canon, make it so that when we see exhibitions that are canonical, audiences start to ask questions of institutions. Well, why wasn't that mentioned? For me, queerness is always a discursive frame placed over the work. And so, if the work isn't discursively represented as queer, the queerest work can hide on a wall, right? And yet at the same time, as I did with the show I just showed you about Face, which was the first exhibition I've done that was the majority Black, brown, and female artists, overwhelming majority. It is also to create alternative visions of canonicity, and to say, wait a minute, why are we not paying attention to these artists? They're every bit as good as the artists we pay attention to.
Absolutely agree. Absolutely agree. And I appreciate that, the kind of putting the veil of queerness, right? It really, really kind of like an umbrella, right? To rethink. But I want to come back to something that Claire said, because Jonathan, this applies to you too. It's like, how does a curator accommodate for and sort of excavate historically silenced voices? For those of you that have done these sort of historical shows, as Claire was saying, there's a kind of dearth of information. There are people whose careers couldn't even flourish given the circumstances. How does one try to create something, not that it could be complete, it never could be, but to accommodate for historically silenced voices? I'd love to hear both of you talk about that.
Well, I can just say, just from my own experience, that I am fortunate to work with an institution, right, with 659, that is willing to underwrite 22 international scholars who are doing exactly this. And Juan is actually one of them. It's an extraordinarily complicated process of dividing the world into regions and asking the kinds of questions, and then asking the question, is the question we're asking appropriate for that region of the world, right? So what we do in Vietnam and China is different than what we do in France or Germany, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's exactly my thesis for global feminisms. What it means to be a feminist in Guatemala is not the same as what it means to be in the Congo, is not the same as what it means to be in New York.
Exactly.
And those are the questions that are so urgently needed, I think, in curatorial practice. So I'm delighted that you've taken it to that kind of global scale. But Claire, did you have some thoughts on the kind of excavating historically silenced voices? I think Juan as well. I mean, that work that you did in the 1920s mostly, that was, I mean, those were works, some of which I'd never seen. Again, like, how can we do this? How can we create something that's ostensibly more comprehensive?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that I go back and forth over. I mean, I think the problem is that if we look at kind of like queer curating, even given the extraordinary projects that people in this room have spearheaded, I think if a lot of us are honest, we would look at the field and think, well, I wouldn't have started from here, in terms of just the art histories that we're handed with, the fact that, it's controversial to talk about queer themes, even in relation to the canon we have, as well as this really important task of the voyage of discovery. I think we need both, and we need to both find ways that we can be more explicit and look at queer analysis in around for existing works, as well as going on these quests to surface voices that are missing. I think one of the really important things that we can do is highlight the problem and highlight surface the voices of activists, and highlight some of these systemic issues. I mean, with Being Human, that was particularly important to the activists I was working with in relation to some of the systemic inequalities around disability. So we had work that was very explicit about the impact of those inequalities, and about this idea of a silenced voice, and that was done for an audio work in the space. But it's a real challenge with the historic material, and as I say, I don't think it's one that I have solved. I've seen some really interesting approaches, such as putting dialogue on the wall between the curator and the director. That was something that the Jewish Museum in London did. I think the more we can sort of like surface the curatorial process as itself a construction, and as something which is partial and is incomplete and imperfect, I think the more we get closer to some of that.
Yeah, and you definitely accommodated for that in Queer British Art, which is a brilliant show with all the letters and some of the more ephemeral, like even the the kind of plays and the theater,
yeah,
and things like
and
that.
we also reached out to activists and community leaders, and got people to just pick a work and put their own interpretation. So that was another layer of, it had multiple layers of interpretation going on in each of the spaces to again try and sort of bring those voices in. But it as I say, I go back and forth over this one a lot.
Yeah, but also you raised you wrote a really great article that I love, which is called Rejecting Normal, I think. And again, Jonathan just raised it with the concept on focus on globalized kind of queerness, but the issues of intersectionality that we've all struggled with, right? Like even when you're looking at a historical show, it's history itself was sexist, misogynist, homophobic. History itself was racist, right? So, I mean, these issues of intersectionality, it's easier, I think, when you're working with contemporary art. But again, when you're looking at historical material, it takes that much more work. And it's really, really frustrating. And I know that you've written about that as well, but I don't know, Juan, Dan, Jonathan, I mean, how do you feel about, the kind of problems of intersectionality when you're looking at a queer curatorial practice?
I would like to go back a little about what Amelia said earlier. I think queerness is mostly about interrogating the structure of power, and power is white and is male, and living in a country such as Spain, in which, for almost 8 centuries, the Arabs lived in this country for 8 centuries, which is a lot of time, and this country has been really ignoring that past, the richness of that past. We have monuments, of course, we have even the language we speak is really fraught with a lot of Arabic expressions, and we have all kinds of representation of art from the Arab world, but still this country has been ignoring the Arabs, and only recently, thanks to the Latin America community, we have young curators, both female and male, who are interrogating, the structure of white gay power in the art community in Spain, and we have brilliant shows, in which they try to expose all these problems, and it's thanks to them, because Spain has, for many years, was not a country for migrants, the structure of the country was 99% white, and Spain had colonies, but a long time ago, although some of them are quite recent, like the Guinea, Equatorial Guinea, for instance, and there are some Black people who are Spanish, of course, also in Spain, But in the last 15 years, the situation has changed. And thanks to that, to the migrant people from Chile, Argentina, etc., we are confronting those issues. This is something I wanted to point out, which I think is very relevant.
I absolutely agree. Dan,
Laura, can I dive in? Yeah, I've been thinking about this question, and I think that one of the things that's on my mind is that, setting aside our accomplishments collectively, because I think, it's quite impressive. I do think there's a point that we get to a point where it becomes more it becomes better if we start to think of ourselves as the canon, like that we've established a canon. And then in fact, the curator's role invariably shifts from finding artists who will fill certain positions in the way we approach the canon to finding curators who are coming up, who in a world of many curators, many more than there were when we all started out, what part of our responsibility is finding curators who will correctly identify us as the canon, and then we'll have our encouragement and support as they set out to replace us.
Yeah, it's so true. And again, this younger generation, obviously, it has at the forefront social justice and these issues that are so critical to the future of our field. And it's interesting though, going back to Birgit, there are endless possibilities when you're working with a community of curators that have no clue about the canon, right? Or that are not trained in art history. Like, so some of these collectives, Birgit, and what you showed us, I mean, that's really transformative because we're trained in art history, right? So to have people that, like you said, like sex workers curating a queer show, like that is a huge contribution. And I love that the Schwulis Museum does that. Do you personally feel that it's really offering like something so fresh and new when you think about it in comparison with other queer shows that you see at museums?
Yeah, I definitely find it fresh and new, because I think the most important, we were talking about queerness should be question power structures, right? And curating is also like, it's authorship, it's like cultural power, it's like interpretative sovereignty. This is all around this figure. It's like the author of the show. And I think the Schwulis Museum as a project which has this very like critical gesture in his foundation, in its foundation, must question this again, and must also question the role of curators and also the role of the museum as an institution. And we try to find possibilities or ways to support communities. We are not, I think this is also important to mention, Schwulis Museum is not an art museum, first of all. It's more a historical museum. And it's around, it has to do with art for sure, we use art, but the main focus is like historical shows, socio-historical, cultural historical shows. And I think this offer we always see that we do have a lot of requests of curators to curate shows with us, like mainly art shows, very often single shows of artists. And most of these people coming and asking, they do have concepts or sometimes even funding. There are, most of them, they are white, male, well-educated, middle class, blah, blah, blah. And so this is the reason why now we really try to question this practice again and to build up like a structure. What I'm talking about is service provider structure to support communities, to support collectives, even also artists who are not, who do not have the connections, who do not have the funding, who do not know how to get the funding, blah, 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 to support them, to be able to tell their own stories and to show their own perspectives. And I think this should be more attitude of every museum.
I agree.
To open up the structure. I would also ask a question, if I'm allowed. Yes. I would really, as most of you are art curators, and I'm really interested to talk about with you if or how the question of pedosexual desire or pedosexual culture affects, in your opinion, the queer art history or also the contemporary art. Are there traces? How do this more or less dark chapter is reflected within the queer canon?
Anybody want to take that?
How do you deal with that?
Oh,
I can take that a little bit.
Okay.
I mean, this was definitely something which was very much a feature of a lot of 19th century art that we were looking at for queer British art. And you have things like the photos of von Gladen, which circulate as this huge kind of cultural touchstone. They get referenced in a lot of paintings. There's this culture of a beautiful youth. Von Gladen himself was, of course, paying the boys to model, but also paying them for sex. And, you know, that is something which is very well known. I think one of the things that we have to do is be honest about our past. And this also applies to the fact that our past is messy and often misogynistic and often racist and classist and ableist. I think that when I started working on queer British art, there was very much a perception that the story we should be telling was a story of heroes, that what we as a community needed was people to look up to who would be like us in some fundamental way, and that we would be able to feel that hand of history and feel better because, you know, these heroic figures from the past were people we could look up with. I think that we need to tell a past that is messy and that contains a lot of sins and a lot of things that are abhorrent as well as things which are heroic. I think there's an advantage to that too, in that I think that allows us to reflect on our own messiness and our own
Simplicity,
perfection, that we also are not these heroes. I think that obviously that is slightly separate from when you're talking about these terrible things in terms of like pedophilia and so on. But at the same time, I think that facing up to our past is something that we need to do as a community. And I'm really impressed by the extraordinary work that the Schroelers Museum has done in exploring some of these incredibly troubling histories.
Agreed. Yeah, and Jonathan, I knew you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I just also want to push back a little bit, because it feels to me like there's a kind of particularity to the idea of queer community and pedophilia that disturbs me, because so much pedophilia in the straight world is unmarked, right? It exists everywhere.
Everywhere.
Totally normalized, right? And so, you know, if we're going to dig into pedophilia, let's dig into pedophilia across the board.
Yeah, like hello, Gauguin and Picasso. I mean, it was considered like blasphemous when, was it the National Gallery of London actually wrote, you know, Gauguin and his 12-year-old, you know, girlfriend, right? As opposed to saying and his, you know, friend, like female friend. I mean, you know, transparency, yes, hello. I mean, we need to start being transparent. Oh, sorry, Fong. Oh, Fong's gonna jump in.
Hi, thank you. I unfortunately need to go to a board meeting at 3 o'clock, but I just want to send my incredible deep appreciation because I admire all of your work. But just following that train of thought there, Claire, and to your point, Birgit and Jonathan, years ago, was it in 2015, I think Jonas Makers and I was having a drink at that Russian board by Anthology Film Archives, and we were handed over a New York Times article. I still remember the lawyer's name. His name is Gerald Harris, the prosecutor of 1964 for obscenity case against Jonas Makers, when he showed Flaming Creature, Jack Smith's film. And then I think not long after that, after having spent 3+ days in jail, he again showed Jean Genet only film, Un Chant d'Amour, you remember? Which is a big deal to our friend Kenneth Anger, certainly launched his career really after seeing that film. But what is so remarkable, because Brian Doherty was the director of the visual at the NEA at the time, defended it, but by doing so, he always able to take criticism from the Republican senators, who was very brutal to the way that they tried to attack Jonas and the artist, obviously. But as the way that Brian put it was very simple. he was asked by all of them, nearly all of them, that whether the film would be made copies so they can study over the weekends. It's very interesting, observation, and we shouldn't be less mindful of it. The one that really repress that homosexual inner life are the one who most ferociously, aggressively, basically attack the very notion of it. But my point is that we are going through a very profound time. I think the pandemic has allowed us to contemplate the power of slowness, which is what the artists do best and what you do best. And I think we just have to reconstitute, retool how to do what we do outside the academy. I think we have great run for several decades since the war ended in Vietnam, 75. And I think when the Cold War ended in 91, it had put terrible condition in the way that we perceive the complexity of our world. And I think that now that we've done all of that wonderful work in the time that we have spent in the academy, I think it seems to me that it's a good timing for us to work together. And I feel there's a deep sense of radicalized in philanthropy too. So there's incredible hope that people who once supported powerful institutions by just lending their name or having something similar attached to their giving, probably more likely looking outside of that mainstream establishment. So that's where we can work together to create that space, because we need to bring what we do in outside of the academy, outside the mainstream artwork consumption. And that's why I agree with you all. And I know that that's how our friend Dan Korea got started, through poetry, So I think all of that cross-pollination is essential at this time. And I'm very profoundly grateful to you all, and profoundly equally optimistic. So I just want to thank you all. Keep going, and this is a nice thing about it. We take our time. Slowness is the only arsenal necessary to counter dictators' deployment of speed. And this is what we're doing. Thank you, you guys.
Thank you, Juan. Thank you for those sharing those beautiful thoughts with us. Thank you so much.
I'll catch up with you later, okay?
Okay. So I know that we have many questions. I'm going to turn to Nick Bennett. I think he's been compiling them for us. I've seen many come through. I'm excited to hear what the audience has to ask us. Take it away, Nick.
I want to echo the thanks and what incredible presentations were shared in the conversation here. This is really important and illuminating, so thank you all. I wish we had the time to get to all of the brilliant questions that are being asked, but I think we can take a few. The first question, I'm going to hand the mic over to you, Cecilia. You should get a prompt to turn on your mic now.
Ah, my dear friend Cecilia. Yay. Thank you, Cecilia.
Hi, hello. Thank you. Has been really wonderful.
Cecilia.
Hear you. Hi, how are you, Dan?
Great.
My big question now, because I mean, you are really all pioneers of this. I mean, looking at the work that Vicente has done, Dan has done, I mean, in very difficult circumstances, especially, but my preoccupation is, like, even thinking of the panels, is the issue of intersectionality, how to really bring together this notion of sort of race, decoloniality, and also expanding beyond even the nomenclature of the queer, because, the queer sort of embodies something that is sort of fairly, I mean, it's very expansive, but it's still so, is this idea of expansiveness, and also this notion of working in teams, in collectivities, so there is multiple voices whenever these things come up. I mean, I would have, I feel that there is a lot of brown and black bodies and decolonial thought that is embedded into this, that is theory about it, and, how can it percolate into the future of the field? Thank you.
Anyone want to take that on? Boy, everybody seems good. Yeah, Jonathan, go for it.
Well, I just wanted to say that I think that one thing that needs to happen as part of this process is that the resource-rich countries need to think about sponsoring exhibitions, which is to say paying local curators to do exhibitions outside of our regions. In other words, it's one thing to talk intersectionality, it's another thing to actually enact it by actually sharing your resources. And so I've been pushing institutions to begin a model of doing exhibitions in cooperation with museums in other parts of the globe, paying them to do the exhibition and then taking that exhibition in our institution.
I like that model. I'm sorry to just jump in like this, but when the Getty did the Pacific Standard Time projects, the model that they were using was that each local museum in Southern California had to interface with experts in the field who had nothing to do with their museum, and they especially promoted collaborative relationships with in-house and independent curators. And I as Jonathan was speaking, I was thinking, wouldn't it be nice to have a queer Getty? Like not well, no, that is what I mean. I mean, wouldn't it be nice that if a foundation could say, look at all these interesting practices out there, let's find people who can find people who can find other people who can bring us the goods. I mean, sorry to put it that crassly, but who can really broaden the conversation and tap the local expertise and real life experience of emerging curators all around the world. Because I think that's when things really start to get enlightening for all of us.
I agree, but I also think that some of those exhibitions are not well received because, let me just chat for a second. I know Cecilia and I have talked about this, but global feminisms was, I think, way ahead of its time. We contacted curators all over the world, Dan, all over. We had advisors on every continent except for Antarctica to help us find artists that were doing really, really interesting work, Linda Nucklin and I. And it's interesting because when we put together 86 artists from 62 countries, the most kind of intersectional, international exhibition the Brooklyn Museum's ever done. And I would say it was 80% BIPOC. And that was very important to me. And what's interesting though, is that the work that we showed, a lot of it was unfamiliar and unknown because it was so new to the West. And we were bringing artists from Africa and artists from the Asia Pacific. And a lot of the curators are so mainstream, including the New York Times, they didn't recognize the artists or the import of a BIPOC perspective in 2007. So, I think that's an important factor, is how do we get the people that review our exhibitions to think more broadly and less myopically and appreciate a kind of more global perspective. And I don't believe that there are many curators working today, sorry if anybody's out there, but not that I know of, at least in the mainstream press, that are thinking about the importance of that kind of intersectional work. Anyway.
Thank you.
No, that was great, Maura.
I'll turn
That
to
was
you.
brilliantly said. Are there any other responses, or should we take another question?
Go for it. Yeah, another question.
Excellent. So next I'm going to pass the mic off to Hongzhen Han. Han, you should get a prompt to turn on your mic at this point. Let's see. Okay. We'll see if we can come back to Han later. Next, I'm actually going to pass the mic now to, just a moment, apologies. I'm checking to see who's here. Actually, I would just like to ask Han's question on his behalf. He says, I remember Professor Katz's groundbreaking exhibition about face, including artists who are not necessarily registered as queer, such as Chinese artist Chen Tuanzhu. Apologies if I mispronounced. I also work for artist Matthew Barney, who is not queer either, but his work explores a wide range of gender and sexual identities. What exactly is the line for queer curation? Does the artist included have to be queer, or does the subject matter have to be queer? And I pass it off to all.
This I feel very strongly about. I don't think there needs to be a line. In fact, what I encourage is that all exhibitions be queer.
Yes.
Bravo.
and that we think queerly in every turn, and in fact, stop contributing to our own ghettoization by saying, oh, we can only look at this. So one of the things that I always try to do in my exhibitions is include artists who are not queer identified, but able to be articulated through a queer lens and discursively, present that aspect of them.
Agreed. I've done the same
Yeah.
thing. My couple exhibitions that I did early on in my career, Neo Queer and Queries, which is at the Shethalle in Zurich, I actually included artists that were very emphatically heterosexual, but whose work was queer. And they were very happy to be reframed that way. And that was very unusual at the time, to actually engage with artists that were straight identified for a queer exhibition. So I love how you just phrased that, Jonathan. So thank you. And I know that Claire wanted to follow up on that.
No, I was just going to vehemently agree with both of you. And also say that I think that this is something which has constrained people from looking at the queer past in particular. When I was doing queer British art, I found that a lot of people seemed to feel that this should be a series of quests for the smoking gun evidence, the letter that says, you and me last night in the bushes, this is what we did, this is what I feel about myself, this is who I am now. And of course, those letters don't exist, or they exist very rarely. They don't exist for queer couples, they don't exist for straight couples. Why are we asking for a higher standard of evidence from queer couples than we are asking for from straight couples? And so we were framing things as broadly as possible. Works that had been claimed as queer by a queer audience or queer viewers, works that expressed an artist's own sexuality, works that connected to their experiences, their perspective, their queer aesthetics, queer relationships. I think that's one of the wonderful things about queer, is it's an incredibly expansive category, and I would hate to see it pinned down too much and forced to wear a suit and tie and be so respectable as to be limited in that way.
No more looking for smoking guns.
I totally agree. I mean, the important thing is not to take into account the sex and gender identity of the artist himself or herself. What really counts is what the artist represents, what the artist is able to do with images, with all kind of materials, what they intend to do. That really counts, and not the identity, the personal, the individual identity of the artist,
But I would actually add a caveat, if I might. I just remember in the early 90s going to a panel discussion at Cooper Union about Matthew Barney, actually. And someone in the audience down in the front, I don't remember exactly who it is at this point, sort of raised their hand and asked a question. They said, I love this work, but I'm asking this from the point of view of the art world and the art market, this person said, which is why after all these years of feminists pushing, to be included, and gay people pushing to be included, that when we finally have a feminist artist who's successful in the market, he's a man. And when we finally have a gay artist successful in the market, he's straight. And that conundrum has kind of been with me ever since, which is that if not pushed against, the fallback position of the art world would be to make everyone straight and white and male again.
Jonathan, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say, Dan, I think that's also an artifact of a slightly different historical moment. I don't know if this is fair, but I do see, I remember a time when Matthew Barney was the perfect artist for an art world that likes queer artists to be straight. But that is no longer the case. And I think we're starting to see, right, a greater sort of ability to broaden and to see more artists. And I'm seeing a prevailing shift in the winds in institutions where we're starting to finally have conversations of, okay, how many BIPOC artists are in the show? What can we do here? I think it's changing. You disagree?
No, I don't disagree. I do believe that the reference I made is already a little bit antiquated. Deb Katz just pointed out that was her panel discussion, and that was representation and value. What role will which is a feminism play in the art world of the 1990s? No, I don't. But again, because I'm a free agent and a lot of my own primary research is based on the gallery system, I am constantly made aware of the circumstances of the market and the degree to which the market drives discourse in the commercial part of the art world. And at a certain point, it may be irrelevant if one's pursuits are exclusively scholarly, what the market is doing. But it's actually quite important to me. And I feel like the power structures in the capitalist system and the power structures in the not-for-profit system are always mirroring each other in ways that don't always accrue to our benefit.
Agreed.
Thank you.
Yeah, Nick, did you want to ask another question?
Yeah, I think we have time for just one more question. Glenn Nuotio, apologies if I'm mispronouncing, but I'm going to pass you the mic. You should be able to turn on your microphone now.
Oh, hi, everyone. Sorry, I don't have my, turn my camera on here. Oh, hi. Hello from Ottawa, Canada. How are you doing? I had a question for Birgit, and just following Amelia's comments about with the Ron 8th exhibit to keep it sexy and fun when thinking about queer content. So I guess my question is for Birgit, where do you see the future role of pornography in queer curating? And thank you everyone for today. This is amazing.
Birgit, you just have to turn on your mic.
Can you please explain what you more precisely what you want to know? What does mean?
There's been a lot of just today. There's been a lot of discussion about sexuality and sexual images in representational art, and I think when you're talking about the museum and its history and its archives of pornography, there hasn't been, and just looking at maybe how academics are being kept a little clean, perhaps one could argue. But I'm just wondering what role in future exhibits do you see the role of pornography playing as either a narrative device or, what role it might evolve into? And anyone can actually answer that if they'd like. I was just thinking of asking you in particular.
I think pornography is like a natural part of talking about queer history or telling queer history. I would say what I'm more interested in, we had a show, it was called Porn That Way, and it was a really great show because it could tell the story of queer emancipation movement within Germany along the pornographic history. And so far, I would say it's like a part of the exhibitions we do. I do not understand the question in the proper way, I think.
Were there, did we want to take maybe one more question? Sorry, Maura, your mic is off.
Oh yeah, that would be great, thank you.
Okay, great. I think I will ask this question on John's behalf because I don't believe John is still in the audience, but John simply asks, how can queer museums create, well, I shouldn't say simply, but how can queer museums create more opportunities for emerging queer curators, especially BIPOC queer curators?
Jonathan, you can probably speak to that, having been associated with the Leslie Lohman.
Yes, Leslie Lohman has been sort of trying to work in that regard. But I think more broadly, what needs to happen is a sort of bifurcated model, one in which there is clearly financial support for the work of curators who are young, who are often not considered when decisions are being made. And so fellowships and funding seem to me absolutely central to this. The other sort of aspect is, I think, what I was trying to suggest earlier of moving outside of the global north and trying to encourage curation in parts of the global south through direct funding. So again, I think it's a question of funding. I'm still waiting for a major financial organization to set up a competitive fund for queer curating. I mean, the Andy Warhol Foundation is a little bit that way, but it would be nice to have it totally formalized.
Agreed. Yes, please. Claire, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, if I can leap in on this too. I mean, I think that as with so many things that we've talked about, there are some inequalities in the museum sector, which queer museums alone are not going to be able to solve. I think that the sort of initiatives that Jonathan's talking about are really important, and we need to diversify our curatorial workforce across the board. We need more disabled curators, we need more BIPOC curators, we need more curators with diverse experiences. Unfortunately, a lot of the sector is set up to discourage those people from the first hurdle, from not giving them paid opportunities to get into the sector, from relying on unpaid labor through sort of placements that aren't paid and so on. I mean, it's a really complex landscape. I think that as queer curators, constantly trying to be and to create the museum that we want to see in the world is absolutely essential. And thinking about that laterally and across the board and continuing to work for that is really important.
I love that. I think that's a wonderful way to end it. Thank you for that, Claire and Jonathan, those final thoughts. It's been amazing. Thank you so much to my fellow panelists and for the work that you've been doing, which has been obviously hugely transformative. So it's such a pleasure that you all agreed to be here today. So thank you. I will turn it back to Nick.
Yes, well, I likewise want to thank everyone, but I also want to thank you, Maura, for putting this together and bringing everyone together yet again for a really brilliant conversation. So here at the Rail, we do have a tradition of ending our lunchtime conversations with a poem. I'm thrilled to welcome today's poet laureate, Mimi Tempestt, to the stage. Mimi Tempestt is a multidisciplinary artist, poet, and daughter of California. She has an MA in literature from Mills College and is currently a doctoral student in the creative critical PhD in literature at UC Santa Cruz. Her debut collection of poems, The Monumental Misrememberings, was published by Co-Conspirator Press in 2020. Without further ado, Mimi, the stage is yours. You should be able, there you are.
Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Nice. All right. This poem is called Blue Black Venus. Stage 1, denial. At the gynecologist's office, she says there is a poison circulating through my blood. Says it's chasing the embryonic versions of my existence like a minotaur in a labyrinth. I walk home below dirty rainbows, whirling in the dead end of my womanhood, sleep for endless hours, dream in blue shaded parables. Every version of myself meets for the seance, argues over the provisions of my failures and successes. Maiden, mother, crone, sits arrogantly against the reality of my fresh disposition, each pointing her finger at the other, unable to admit shame over my new set of consequences. Stage 2, anger, he's to blame. The nigga who poisoned me, and the other one who borrowed my innocence, traded it for a bump of cocaine, and the other one who mirrored me as victim to our addictions, and the other one who groped me at the after hours, and the other one who was too afraid to love me out loud, and the other one who was looking for his mother in my pussy, and the other one who deemed my body a play chess on Pleasure Island. The nigga who needs to read this isn't even apt to be on this page. My whole life I've been talking to dirty walls. I'd smear my period blood and inscribe free for fun, but realized that dying was the only thing I agreed upon when I came into this cosmic plane, this revolving door of contradictions, this ongoing diatribe of avoiding all the ways this life can violently end. I know I'm on my way out. I exited stage left before my first cue, act one, scene one, enter into an empty and noiseless stage. From the wings we hear prolonged sobs echoing into a chamber of infinity and doubt. Mimi, 29, a fat black and queer poet, enters grimly on stage, plops her body at its center and locks into the fetal position. Mimi continues, my life is now a monologue of deep mourning. I will no longer keep this rage locked inside my belly. And what happens when the cage is sick of coveting me as catatonic? And what happens when I get bold enough to stick my head above the clouds and admit that a sunny day cost $1 too many? And what happens when I tell him my womb doesn't work? I guess I will never be the object God designed me to be. Blackout. See, the niggas who need to read this branded me a nigga making machine. They cry revolution, yet play cog in the utility belt of men that gang bang Gaia. They parade around as moral men, fathers to generations of goddesses downgraded to sex slaves, boys disguised as warriors who placate their failed gender with their minuscule dicks, poets and artists brooding through their cities, held prisoner to their transient thoughts. They plant polluted seeds, populating thirsty minds, then laugh at the parable of consent, deem it a wayward idiom for the very thing they claim they want, they never had. Man, my pussy is metastasized into a doorway of consecutive non-believers. She finds truth in a psyche that's lost its grip. Her name is none. Her language is barely. The hour wedged, the gag, their semen sliding into 2-day-old panties. Each droplet seeps into a stain of thorns and petals bushed at the opening of her now pursed lips. The moisture is fixed. Mumbles at the crossing of legs, only at the entrance of his name, Ozymandias. Conquering time with the fever snatching, grains of sand conquering upwards, inhaling storms, eddies of indecision to give birth, bubbling, berating in fantasies, friction and creating life, mothering to dictate if the life is worth lived, avoiding duration, avoiding living, avoiding temptation, avoiding, you thought climax would be the next word. You think wet is a testimony. You think hard thinking did too little for the heart. My pussy, she clamps down, permeates until sacred. She bites until bruised, sacrifices, and then leeches off the excess. She writes letters to strangers, bleeds for the full moon every month. She Venus flytraps men who smile pearls in bright rooms. She kisses foreign men in dark alleyways. She's determined to deepen my madness while making bastards out of men's strongest soldiers. Stage 3, bargaining. A message from the ancestors. This is not your fault, but it is your responsibility to heal through. Let the tears you cry sting like acid. Instead, I popped a tab on Khalifa's island, heard the sirens cry from the riverbanks. My friend, she heard them too. She was more eager than me to dive into a divine death. I convinced her that drowning was the event that was already taking place, convinced her that they weren't beckoning for her to join them, convinced her to hear their lullaby as offering, as reconciliation. Stage 4, depression. I escaped from Los Angeles with the skeleton in my suitcase. It crawled out of its confinement, pulled down my blouse, sucked greedily on my areolas, cried unforgiven before it slept. It made a scene about being wrapped in dirty sheets, claimed I was harboring a desire to destroy Father Time. Stage 5, acceptance. At the grocery store, an elderly Black woman, plum sweet, looked deep into the barrels of my eyes, said sadness is a towering fiend. Said he makes claim in the hollowing of your stomach, feeds you breadcrumbs, then testifies that you've been fed pie. She gave me her pen and paper, suggested I make a list of the very desire I was shopping for, suggested that the key to getting over oneself is to revel in the reality of being misunderstood. She told me, your tears ain't nothing new. She suggested I continue writing into an untapped possibility. Thank you all for having me.
Thank you, Mimi, for concluding today with that passion and power. I wish we were in a physical room so we could hear thunderous applause. Thank you so much. And by extension, thank you, Dan. Thank you, Birgit. Thank you, Juan. Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Maura. Thank you, Jonathan. It's been an honor today. I also want to share the Brooklyn Rail is a nonprofit, so if you enjoyed today's event, please consider making a donation to help support our programming. We also do this every day at 1 p.m., so if you can, join us tomorrow for a conversation on art and architecture between Peter Ballman and Rail editor-at-large Joan Waltemath. We'll conclude with a poetry reading from our dear Rail comrade, Lynn Crawford. You can now all turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you wish. And I wish you all a very queer rest of your day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks so
Thank
much.
you so much.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Dan.
Nick.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Mimi.
Maura.
Thank you,
Thanks
Juan.
everyone
Thank
for
you so much,
joining.
Everyone.
Mimi.
Thank you, everyone.
Juan.
Take care.
Ciao, everybody.
Thanks, Claire. Thanks,
Thank you.
Maura.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks so
Dan.
much.
Thanks, Juan.